So now we're going to dive into a discussion of philosophy and ethics. And to do this, we're going to give a little bit of historical background on some key Greek thinkers and some outlines of some basics of their thought. Now, we're picking the text, pick these thinkers, and we're picking up on these thinkers in the lecture because the streams of thought the streams of thought that they represent have had an important influence on the historic development of Christian theology. Most of these that we'll talk about, Christian theology has sort of wrestled with and appropriated in some way. And most of them also, some of them more than others, Christian theology has developed kind of in resistance to. And hopefully you'll see that as we begin to draw out some of these themes. So the first one we're going to look at is the Greek philosopher Plato. And we talked a little bit about Plato in the first class and in the first lecture when we talked about the Euthyphro dilemma. So a few elements of Plato's thought that were became important in the development of Western philosophy and of Christian theology. So one of the key things that Greek philosophy and that Plato wrestled with was the relationship between the one and the many. And this continues to be a question that philosophy wrestles with even today. Various branches of philosophy continue to wrestle with even today. And what do we mean by this idea of the one and the many? Well, the idea of the many is that I have another way to phrase this is universals and particulars. So I have a particular thing in front of me. So let's say that I've got a nice glass of Bordeaux in front of me. And I'm kind of swirling this thing in the glass. I'm kind of smelling the aroma of it. I'm taking a little taste and swishing it around in my mouth. And how am I thinking of what this thing is? Is it just one particular kind of bit of crushed grape juice, fermented grape juice? Or is it a category of a thing that I could call wine? And if it's a category of thing, what is that category of thing? Is that category something actual? And what we're doing here is we're talking about metaphysics, right? We're talking about what is real, what actually exists. So is what is real only this particular thing in front of me, and it really doesn't have any meaning beyond itself? Or does this particular thing in front of me point toward a category of things that actually is real? Now, why does this matter? You could argue that it doesn't matter, but one reason why it could matter is we might ask, well, is this glass of wine a good glass of wine? How would I decide if a particular glass of wine is a good glass of wine? Now, part of that might just be, well, in this particular moment, I enjoy it. But if, we're going to give things like gold medals and rankings and points and things like that to glasses of wine and have competitions, well, then we've got some idea of excellence. And that idea of excellence is going to have to relate to some broader category of what this thing represents. So, this particular glass maybe is particularly plummy and luxurious and long on the palate and has some beautiful spice notes underlying it. It has just the right amount of tannins so that it has a little bit of acidity but not too much. All of these kinds of things suggest a standard of excellence and a broader category that this particular glass fits into. And if we can think of that for something like wine, we can also think of that for something like, say, human beings. Here is this particular human being. Here am I, this particular human being. Am I a good human being? What makes a good human being, an excellent human being? Or do I just happen to exist in this moment and there's really nothing beyond that? This is the basic question one of the basic questions Plato wrestles with, and as you can see as I'm talking about it, it's a question that's going to develop into our ideas about ethics and our ideas about Christian theological ethics. Well, what if I have this glass of wine in front of me and I am deciding that it's not a very good glass of wine, that my idea of a really good Bordeaux has some of the elements I mentioned before, that, it has a length on the palate. It doesn't make me sort of purse my lips, but it feels really smooth, and it's got some deep notes to it, and it's got a lovely fragrance, and it doesn't have any kind of metallic or harsh aftertaste and various things like that. Well, what if it has some of those negative qualities? There's a gap between the ideal of what I think is really excellent and good and what is actually in front of me. That gap, that lack, that deprivation of the ideal is the sense that Plato developed as what evil means. Now, we don't typically think of, well, a bad glass of wine is sort of morally evil. And I don't necessarily want to communicate that idea to you, but just the notion that the ideal exists and the particular has some distance from the ideal and lacks something that the ideal has. It's a deprivation or a lack. Christian theology, particularly in Augustine, who we'll meet next week, picks up that idea of evil, and it remains kind of an important concept for what evil is. Because, if we think of evil as something affirmative, then what we're saying is that evil has a category of existence like any other created thing. But remember, all there is, from the perspective of Christian theology, is God and creation. There is nothing else. And that would mean that if evil has an affirmative existence, that God is ultimately the author or creator of evil. And that's something we can't say. That's something Christian theology cannot and will not say. It would be logically absurd and would not be how we define God. So there are a number of ways to try to think through this, and one way to try to think through it is to sort of borrow this concept from Plato and say that, well, evil is not an affirmative thing. Evil is a deprivation or a lack from the ideal of creation as God really intended it. Now, there are lots of problems with framing it that way, and I would actually probably say that the trend in modern theology is to move away from that kind of framing. Personally, I think it's a really valuable framing, but it's something we'll talk about throughout the semester. Okay, another thing for Plato that's related to all this, now Plato is writing in a Greek society that, although we associate it with the origins of democracy, and that's correct in a sense, it also was a very hierarchical society. And so, there were people who were elites, there were people who were not elites and didn't have as many rights, women, for example. Politically at least. There were people who had no rights at all, slaves, and all of these different elements of society were seen to have kind of their own proper place, and then their own kind of set of virtues that were appropriate to their own place. So the virtues of an excellent woman in the view of the ancient Greeks were not the same as the virtues of an excellent free man, and the virtues of an excellent free man were not the same as the virtues of a slave. And so each sort of place in society had its own virtue associated with it. And this, we'll see, this gets picked up also in Christian theology, and there are even hints of it in Scripture. For example, in the household codes in some of the Pauline or Deutero-Pauline epistles, where Paul talks about kind of the relationship of the husband and the wife and so on. And some of that, probably does reflect this Hellenistic cultural background that ultimately has kind of a hierarchical society. And we'll see it also when we talk about virtue ethics and some other things. So it's something we'll want to think about. I'm not, of course, necessarily commending that kind of hierarchical society. I'm just laying it out there as part of the background that we're going to think through.